Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to the African American Heritage House and the 2021 CHQ Assembly. My name is Errol Davis, and I have the distinct honor and privilege of serving as president of the African American Heritage House here at Chautauqua, or AAHH as we fondly refer to it. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this 8th of 10 lectures that the AAHH will sponsor or co-sponsor this season. We are a diverse support organization which is informed by the African American experience. We are committed to strengthening Chautauqua, and we do this in a variety of ways. We do it by encouraging and certainly welcoming diversity. We do it by fostering honest conversations, such as the Mirror Project, and we also do it by adding robust new voices to the programmatic mix. Our focus over the last few years, however, has been primarily on getting the narrative correct. Our view at the AAHH is that we must get the history correct, to get the understandings correct, to get the future relationships correct. It's that simple. It is imperative that we own both our past as well as our present. Thus, we are committed. We're committed to telling the stories that need to be told, primarily from the perspective of historically marginalized people. I encourage all of our viewers to visit our website, as is shown on the screen, aaheritagehouse.org, to learn how you can support and even become involved in our work. As we are entirely supported by contributions, I also want to thank our many friends and supporters for making both last season as well as this season possible. Without the generosity of our friends and supporters, we would be unable to bring the quality speakers to Chautauqua that we have over the years and are doing so again this season. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Thank you for supporting this work. This week's thematic focus at Chautauqua is on the state of the economy. Where do we go from here? We were pleased to work with the institution to present Dr. Raphael Bostic, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, as the main amphitheater speaker earlier this week. Today, our speaker is Dr. Andre Perry, senior fellow with the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program, scholar in residence at American University, and columnist for the Hechinger Report. He is the author of the book, Know Your Price, Valuing Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. His research focuses on race and structural inequality, education and economic inclusion, and his scholarship at Brookings has analyzed Black majority cities and institutions in America while focusing on valuable assets worthy of increased investment. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, Dr. Perry has documented the underlying causes for the outsized number of coronavirus-related deaths in Black communities. His research at Brookings has illuminated how certain forms of social distancing historically accelerated economic and social disparities between Black people and the rest of the country. He also has mapped racial inequities in housing, income, and health to underscore how policy discrimination has made Black Americans more vulnerable to COVID-19. Pardon me. Dr. Perry's academic writings have concentrated on race, structural inequality, and urban schools. He co-authored the Brookings Institute report, The Devaluation of Assets in Black Neighborhoods, and has presented these findings across the country, including to the U.S. House Financial Services Committee. I am truly honored that he has agreed to share his thoughts with us here today, and I know that you're going to find his remarks both enjoyable and enlightening. However, before we begin today's lecture, our audience should know that you may submit questions for our live Q&A with Dr. Perry through the submission portal at questions.chq.org, which is on your screen at the moment. And you can do this from any mobile or desktop browser. Or if you use Twitter, use the hashtag CHQ2021. Today's remarks were pre-recorded. However, they will be followed by a live Q&A with Dr. Perry with questions submitted by our live audience tuning in from around the world. I'm also joined today in the Q&A segment by my colleague, Tim Ringillian, a fellow board member of the AAHH. My fellow Chautauquans, the AAHH is pleased to present to you Dr. Andre Perry.
Well, thank you, African American Heritage House, for allowing me to speak today. Again, I'm Andre Perry, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, where I study black majority cities and neighborhoods and the assets in them, the things that can propel economic and social mobility. You know, this journey of mine on values in homes actually started with an analysis of my own hometown, Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania. Wilkinsburg is a small black majority municipality surrounded by Pittsburgh on three sides. And I'm going to tell you a story that was told to me. You see this home? This is where I grew up. This is 1320 Hill Avenue, Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania. As you can see, the home is boarded up, the roof is bowed, it needs work. You can actually pick up this home if you agree to pay the taxes on it. But the home is worth so much more to me. See this woman pictured here? Her name is Elsie Boyd. I call her Mom. As was told to me, Mom made a deal with my maternal grandmother that she would take me in when I was born. You see, my mother, Karen, she was poor. She already had a child at 15, had me when she was 17. She was probably abused. And so Mom did what a lot of matriarchs did at the time. She informally adopted me. And she took in not just me and my brother, but about a dozen or more other kids throughout my lifespan. Some would stay for a few days, some would stay for a few weeks, others months. I stayed till I graduated from high school. Well, one of the reasons why I had to stay with Mom was my father, who's pictured here, Floyd. He was a heroin addict. He was in and out of prison. He probably abused my mother. And later, he was eventually killed in prison, largely related to his heroin addiction. I went out to study their life by looking at the physical conditions around them and researching my book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. Almost immediately, I found that they both lived in areas that were redlined, where the Homeowners Loan Corporation drew red lines around black neighborhoods, deeming them too risky for investment. They were also displaced by highway projects led by the Federal Highway Administration that put highways literally on top of black neighborhoods, displacing the residents. They also lived in places where there was urban renewal, what James Baldwin called a program for Negro removal. And they were surrounded by racial housing covenants, so they could not leave those areas. And when they did try to buy homes, there were a lot of predatory lending around that. And so I wanted to look at that past history and its impact on today's current environment. Well, my colleagues, Jonathan Rothwell and David Harshbarger and I started looking at home values in black majority neighborhoods, comparing them to their white counterparts. Now, what we found is what most people will assume, that homes in white areas in general are priced higher than in black neighborhoods. And in fact, as the concentration of blackness in a neighborhood increase, the prices decrease, and it's pretty linear. We looked at Zillow data, we looked at census data, and you can see the linear line going downward as the population of the black population increases. But most people will blame education and crime on the lower values in black neighborhoods. Well, those are things you can control for in a study, and that's what we did. We controlled for education, crime, walkability, and all those fancy Zillow metrics. And what we found pretty much astounds, that homes in black neighborhoods are underpriced by 23%, about $48,000 per home, cumulatively. That's about $156 billion in lost equity, $156 billion. And it ranges widely from area to area. Certainly there are some places where the home values in black neighborhoods are actually priced higher than their white counterparts. On this chart, you see where all the magenta circles are, that's where homes are devalued. Wherever you see a green circle, that's where homes in black neighborhoods are priced higher. And you can see there's a lot more magenta than green. But $156 billion is pretty significant. And I just want to put that number in perspective. I'll give you some examples. 156 billion would have paid for or financed 4 million black-owned businesses based on the average amount black people use to start their firms. It would have paid for more than 8 million four-year degrees based upon the average amount of a four-year public education. It would have replaced the pipes in Flint, Michigan 3,000 times over, covered nearly all of Hurricane Katrina damage, and it's doubled the annual economic burden of the opioid crisis. It's a big number. And the reason why I talked about that last point, that is double the annual economic burden of the opioid crisis, is clear. It should be made clear. My father had a heroin addiction. Now, if he lived in a neighborhood where the home values were at market rate or the white rate, he would have had better schools. Remember, municipalities partially fund schools through the values assessed on their homes. He would have had better infrastructure. Municipalities use those taxes to fund things like infrastructure. He would have had a better opportunity to go to college, start a business, and advance himself and his family. His drug use probably would not be criminalized. He would have had an opportunity to go to a drug treatment center instead of a prison where he later died. Now, I'm often asked this question, what's the difference between my father and me? Certainly, I'm doing well. I'm able to present to you. And I say to them, there is no difference. That there are many black people who are snatched up by racism. And this is why I always say there's nothing wrong with black people that ending racism can't solve. When something goes wrong in black communities, we blame the people. We don't look at the overall policy conditions that erode the quality of life of those people, that extracts wealth and opportunity and money and equity from their household budgets. Clearly, again, I'm doing well, but my father should have been right here speaking to you today. We are no different. Now, I'm going to just give you some of the implications of that action, because we know that most people start their businesses using the equity in their home. And so if you don't have equity, if home ownership rates are lower, you're going to have less businesses. Now, case in point, black people represent about 14% of the population, but only 2% of the nation's employer firms, meaning firms with more than one employee. Now, but a lot of people will say that the reason why you don't see as many black businesses is because of the quality, because of service, because folks don't know how to manage their businesses. And so I wanted to explore that issue as well, because we know that, again, black people represent about 14% of the population, only 2% of the employer firms. When we do get loans, we pay higher interest rates, and so we want to see investment. So what I did, again, with David Harshberger, Jonathan Rothwell, we scraped all the Yelp data from businesses all across the country to get a sense of quality. And then we controlled for a lot of the factors, again, to get an apples-to-apples comparison. We looked at spending power, education, again, so we could really get a sense of what equal businesses are valued. And what we found may surprise some, that businesses, that black, brown, and Asian businesses are actually rated higher on Yelp than their white counterparts, but they get less revenue as the neighborhood gets blacker. I'll show you another chart. See this, I'll show you another chart. See this, see that x-axis, that bottom line? Again, that's the concentration of black people in a neighborhood. And on the y-axis, that's the rating. Again, black, brown, and Asian businesses score higher on Yelp in all neighborhoods, but the score goes down as the neighborhood gets blacker. In addition, they're losing revenue as a result. Folks aren't patronizing those businesses in black neighborhoods. And high quality businesses are losing out on upwards of $4 billion as a result. Now, there's a saying in the hood that my elders and others used to utter, and it's something that spoke to me in this study. They would say, our ice is just as cold. Our ice is just as cold. The elders knew that if you don't frequent businesses, quality businesses in the hood, you distort the market in ways in which high quality businesses are forced to compete against low quality businesses, that less revenue goes to the hood, meaning less development, less economic development, less community development. They knew they were onto something there. And this is part of the nature of my research. It led to a lot of the writing of Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black City. And you can find a lot of this research in that book. But again, it emphasizes that black assets are devalued, that there's policy actions that ignore or deflate the potential and the opportunity of assets in black neighborhoods. Now, a lot of people will say that can't be true. In fact, I was in a hearing that I would love for you to see this clip where Representative Al Green asked me and members of the appraisal industry a basic question. He asked us, do we feel that there's discrimination in the housing industry? And I'm going to share that clip with you now.
If you think black people are being discriminated when their property is being appraised, would you kindly raise your hand? One person on the panel. If you think that, for fear that I'm not communicating well, if you think that black people are not being discriminated against when their property is being appraised, if you think they're not being discriminated against, kindly raise your hand. Okay, hands now. We're getting some consternation, I see.
Now, that exchange was phenomenal. That exchange was 2 years ago. And since then, there's been a racial reckoning in the real estate industry in which we now recognize there's racial bias in appraisals. Now, my 23%, 48,000 devaluation encompasses many different factors in the market, not just appraisals. But if people deny racism, like you saw in that clip, they are burying their head in the sand to the very problems that's throttling black growth and throttling the economy overall. You know, if, again, black people represent about 14% of the population, but only 2% of employer firms. If the percentage of employer firms match the black population, we would see 800,000 more firms in the United States. 800,000 more firms. Trillions of dollars of revenue. Greater GDP. More employment. More increases in salaries. I mean, we are cutting our nose to spite our face every single day when we don't invest in black assets. You know, equity is stimulus. When we invest in the underappreciated assets, everyone wins. So there's not a sense of, if I give to black people, I'm taking away from whites. You know, nothing grows without investment, nothing. You know, Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese philosopher, once said that if you see a head of lettuce and it's not growing, you don't blame the lettuce. You look to see if the soil is rich. You look to see if it's getting rainwater. You look to see if it's getting sunlight. You don't blame the lettuce. But when things go wrong in black neighborhoods, we blame the lettuce. And we have got to end that and invest in the underappreciated assets that are right next to us. Now, I named my book, Know Your Price, from a famous play by my favorite playwright August Wilson, who's also from Pittsburgh. And in the play, Two Trains Running, there's a main character named Memphis. Memphis is about to have his property seized through eminent domain by the city of Pittsburgh, and they offer Memphis $15,000 for his property, to which Memphis says, no, I'm not selling my property for $15,000. I know my price. I got my price. I'm paraphrasing, but it's a refrain throughout the play. I got my price. I know my price. There's another character, Hambone. Hambone agrees to paint a front fence with a proprietor in exchange for a ham. So Hambone paints the fence, but the proprietor never gives him his ham. And throughout the play, he demands his ham. Give me my ham. Give me my ham. And we don't know if he had mental illness before that moment, but he eventually goes mad and dies demanding his ham. Now, I know folks are a little bit depressed, but there is actually a happy ending. Memphis, the main character, after complaining and demanding his worth, eventually gets $35,000. He gets the market rate or the white rate. Well, the moral of the story is you got to know you have worth. What I try to do in Know Your Price is give people the price to stand on, even if it means going crazy and dying. We can't live not realizing our value. And so my message to you, I talk about housing a lot, talk about business, but at some point we must make a demand for our value. Whether you're Black, white, Latino, Asian American, we all must realize we're in this together. If there's anything I learned throughout this pandemic experience, is when our neighbors are sick, we are vulnerable. And that's true economically as well. And so the investments that we make must recognize that we have a population in this country that was injured by federal, state, and local policy. And we've got to acknowledge that. Now, I don't want to go away without giving you concrete solutions on how to address devaluation. First, you must invest in people, right? You must invest in people. Now, a lot of people take an approach where they invest in place. They invest in the brick and mortar and the overall community development of an area. But if you invest in place at the expense of people, the property values will rise and people will eventually be pushed out. So you got to invest in people, direct investment in potential homeowners, current homeowners, tax credits, down payment assistance, mortgage assistance, business grants. Again, and we shouldn't have people jump through unnecessary bureaucratic hoops to get those funds. I don't know how many times I've looked at business programs where they made Black people go through some type of financial literacy course, accounting course in order to get a grant. Again, the research shows our businesses are just as good. Our ice is just as cold. But you still must invest in place because the overall devaluation creates an environment where there is less resource in those neighborhoods. So you do need to invest in place so that folks can beautify and animate and restore property. In addition, we've got to divest from racism. Now, there's lots of practices, particularly in housing, that were born during a segregated time. The price comparison approach in determining value by appraisers, for instance, were really drawn from an era where we were segregated. And what's problematic about that is that when you compare properties to others in the same neighborhood that's been discriminated against, you essentially just recycle the discrimination over and over again. And so we need new practices. Just as we use a whole lot of data from across the country, we could determine value by looking at equivalent homes and equivalent circumstances across a metropolitan area. So there are different ways to establish value, and we need to find those. In fact, I'm partnering with the Ashoka organization for a $1 million challenge for those who are interested in solving for devaluation. And you can Google that partnership, again, Ashoka and Brookings, to get more information on that. But again, you have to invest in people, invest in place, divest from racism. And if we can do those things, we can actually demand the price that we deserve. Well, again, I'm Andre Perry, author of Know Your Price and senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and it's been a pleasure talking with you, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Dr. Perry, thank you for that excellent presentation. I was smiling all the way when you said you grew up in Wilkinsburg. I grew up in Homewood, right next door, right next door to you.
Yeah.
And you probably went to some high school that my high school, Westinghouse High School, beat up in football. But I won't.
Yeah, on occasion. A rare occasion, I'll say. We actually see my Wilkinsburg Letterman jacket right over there.
Sure do.
I'm representing to the fullest.
Well, I no longer can wear the clothes I wore in high school. I was 125 pounds at that point. But again, I understand your stories about Pittsburgh. I understand the urban renewal in Pittsburgh, particularly of the Lower Hill District there. And certainly I share your appreciation for the work of August Wilson. We've got a number of questions, some of which have come in on our questioning portal. So let me get right to those. I have one that has come in, I think, that will really transition from the last point that you made, which is how do we and can we make up the loss from practices like redlining? Any examples you can give of public or private efforts that can be scaled?
Oh, absolutely. I know what's coming. A lot of folks will ask, what about reparations? And certainly reparations can be a program. And actually reparations programs are happening all over the United States right now. In Evanston, there's a housing program. Now it's small in scope. They're talking about giving a small number of people $25,000 in down payment assistance. You have Asheville, a reparations program there. They're talking about it in Los Angeles and in states in terms of education subsidies, scholarships to predominantly white institutions that denied Black people entrance into those colleges and universities. And so there are lots of things that can be done on the reparations fund, but there's also things that can be done from everything from tax credits to some type of down payment assistance. Remember, we actually know how to do it. We just don't know how to do it for Black people. One of the reasons why we have this enormous wealth gap is because we dedicated resources to white people. And for me, I don't see a way out of having some type of race-based initiative to restore the value that's been extracted by racism. I think you almost have to have that. It's going to be difficult because of the constitutional arguments that will be made that you can't use race, any kind of race-based strategies. But we have in the past, and we can now. My initiatives generally look at place. I just look at the concentration of Black people in place. And so you could theoretically create programs and initiatives for communities that are devalued, new mortgage programs, new credit scoring systems, new appraisal systems. These are all things that can help restore the value. But I also want to say that let's be clear, we need to scrub racism from our federal policy. I was fortunate enough to have my research inside of a few of President Biden's executive orders. It's been a focal point, particularly on the appraisal front. But we have got to remove the drags of racism from our federal policy. That 23% difference in home prices really is a statement that there is still racism in our housing markets. And so we need to locate, identify, and scrub those bad practices from our policies. And so we have work to do, but we can do it.
Again, you touched on very quickly on some of the objections to policy, and that is the constitutional prohibitions against policies that are race-based. And I continue to search for a solution, but I'm also cognizant of the fact that race-based policies got us where we are today. And so it would seem to me that, how do we make that point clearer to all? We are trying very hard here at AAHH to just put the history on the table. But in this country, as you are well aware, we have a common core in math, we have a common core in science, we have no common core in history because we cannot agree on our history. And so what
I will say is regarding that, before you ask a question, in general, there's a resistance to history in general, and there is a proactive attempt to erase and provide false history in this country. It goes without saying, now we're really seeing how the narrative of the lost cause in terms of the Confederacy, support of the Confederacy played out in our history texts. Much of the narratives around the Confederacy occurred well into the 30s, 40s, and 50s. It was well after the Civil War. And so there's just a proactive effort to uplift whiteness and suppress the sordid history that we have. I mean, if you talk to any credible historian, they're all in agreement around the perils of slavery, Jim Crow racism, redlining, all these other issues. But you have politicians that have been actively suppressing that history. And so from a scholarship standpoint, there's not as much disagreement there. I mean, we know it, we see it, but there's just an effort to say, no, we can't. Somehow it's like, if we tell this history, somehow the sky is going to fall and America is going to blow up somehow. No, I mean, but the longer we deny history, the more we don't own up to the moral obligation to deal with current day issues. All these things that I talk about are in current day. The data that I use for housing, 2017. When we say deny history, it is an effort to say we won't give people in Black and brown communities, Black communities, the value they deserve. That's what it's saying. And so for me, we have a moral obligation. It's not just a financial one, it's a moral obligation. And so when people deny history and what has gone on in this country, I really shake my head, because at some point you have got to look yourself in the eye and in the mirror and say, am I a part of the subjugation of Black people?
Thank you for that comment. You talk about moral obligations. If I live in a world, however, and you touched on this in your talk, where I truly believe that in order for you to get something, I have to give up something. And so as Adam Smith said, I'm always going to act in my enlightened self-interest, and although you may describe that as not being very enlightened at this point due to the perhaps immorality of it, that's the situation we find ourselves in, I think, in this country. And I wrestle constantly with how do we get out of that situation?
Yeah, but, as I brought up in the talk, what's interesting for me is when we invest in underappreciated assets, meaning if you add water, it will grow, everyone benefits, the entire economy benefits. And so there is an unenlightened self-interest. And that's what we're seeing being played out. It is this belief that we will maintain power, even if it means cutting my nose to spite my face, even if it means not getting the revenues to expand the economy. And you're seeing this played out somewhat around the coronavirus. There are people willing to die for a belief that makes no sense. I really believe that comes from racism, because we have a long-standing history of people upholding whiteness, even if it means the detriment of a democracy. It means the death of people. It means robbing people of value and dignity. People are willing to live with that, but that's not very enlightened.
No.
And that's why, at the end of the day, I say, I try to make a head case with numbers. I try to make a heart case with narrative. But at the end of the day, you also need to have a demand. That's what Know Your Price is about. You got to make a demand, because some people they just won't listen to reason. They just won't. And so that's where the demand comes in.
Yeah. Well, you are so correct. I find when Ronald Reagan can say a rising tide will lift all boats and therefore will cut taxes, that is seemingly accepted. But when we say a rising tide will lift all boats, let's invest in people, that seems to get a different reception. My colleague, Timron Gillian, is dying to ask a question or two over here, and I got to let him do that or I'll hear about it later, I assure you.
Thank you, Errol. And Dr. Perry, welcome. Thanks for being with us. I want to take us maybe from the moral and values-based plane a little bit more into the policy realm, and ask you a question about systems of taxation. You talked early on in your talk about the importance of the property tax as a means of funding schools and infrastructure, but spoke later about it as having the unintended consequence sometimes of creating gentrification, displacing people from the homes that they've occupied for long periods of time. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on the best system of taxation. Is that income-based, sales tax, wealth-based, land value capture? What makes sense to achieve the goals that you're talking about?
Well, I always start by saying, remember that all value is socially constructed. And much of our taxation system in various forms are really rooted in you have a few gatekeepers determining what's good value and what's not of good value. Mm-hmm. And in Black neighborhoods, what we've seen is on the appraisal side, homes in Black neighborhoods gets valued lower. But when it comes to property assessments, we get taxed higher because there was this assumption that Black people use more services and a lot of this other racist rhetoric. But what it really meant is that you had a long-standing history of taxing Black neighborhoods more so you could lower taxation in white neighborhoods. And so the taxation on Black neighborhoods would make up for that lost revenue. And so we know that in general, we've got to really examine all of these mechanisms, from tax assessments to appraisals to how we deem risk. I always am just befuddled by this idea that exclusively white wealthy neighborhoods are generally seen as lower risk, when that exclusivity causes so many problems for everyone else. Mm-hmm. And so, but when you look at where lower interest rates and tax assessment, we've rewarded segregation in so many different ways. And so we've got to really recalibrate our systems and create new ones. And I'll just use my area of interest in home valuation. Generally people use a cost comparison model in neighborhoods to value homes. But just what we did was we said, let's not bound it by the neighborhood. Let's look at the entire metro area, because we have enough data now to look at equivalent homes, equivalent social circumstances, and establish value that way. And so I challenge people, say, hey, we just have way too much data, way too much know-how to lean on these practices that are vestiges of our segregated past. And so it really means let's unpack this social construction of value. And when we do, we can come up with more appropriate mechanisms to determine taxation, valuation, and other metrics.
Great, thank you. I'd like to also bring you into a conversation, again, at more of a policy level that's been raging on the grounds here at Chautauqua this week, and that's around the minimum wage. We had a speaker, Robert Dorff from the American Enterprise Institute on Tuesday, who made logical arguments against increasing the minimum wage, and there was a lot of questioning and pushback on his positions, and a discussion the next day from Dr. Bostic about the fact that a minimum wage is really about a question of values and how you value individual labor versus creating opportunities and federal subsidies of workplaces. How do you analyze that in the context of your notion of investing in people?
Well, I'll put it in very plain or simple terms. And I think it's a fundamental right for people to be able to work and live in the same area. And so right now that to really, on a national average, to really afford a one-bedroom apartment, you generally, on average, have to make $20, so a little bit more than $20 an hour. The federal minimum wage is $7.25, I believe, seven and some change. That just doesn't add up at all. I mean, it has to come closer. And so, in order for us to just live and work and reside, there needs to be a calibration of our housing, our what we earn, what we saw just a few weeks ago, last week, in fact. People were the eviction moratorium ended, and it is about 6 million people across the country were in jeopardy of being evicted. Mm-hmm. Now, I say this, that the moratorium wasn't a solution, because even when folks are working, they are house insecure. And so when people say, the minimum wage is fine and this is not the issue, I'm like, what do you want? I mean, honestly, what do you want? Do you want people to live in the street? Do you want people to be insecure, always in control of landlords and wealthy landowners? At some point, we've got to recognize that we have a system in place that is about power and control, not about fairness, honesty, integrity, democracy. And for the last 30 years, Errol mentioned about Ronald Reagan. Wealthy people had used their increased wealth to influence policy, while the wealthiest Americans see their earnings and holdings rise at phenomenal rates. Wage stagnation has kicked in. That is not by coincidence. That is because people have said, you don't own, I do. I can control what you do, where you work, where you live. And that just is not tenable, and it's just not decent. So for me, I mean, the math just doesn't add up. We don't bat an eye when the wealthiest of Americans continue to use their wealth to influence taxation policy. We don't care. But when folks on the lowest rung of economic rungs of society demand change, they say, no, that'll hurt the economy. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
The concept of working and living in the same area is one that is of great interest to me. You describe the impacts in terms of the individuals themselves, in terms of how much they make and could they live in an area. But I think we should also make a case that it's injurious to the areas if the people can't work there. I lived in Connecticut in a rather Tony community there. and nobody that provided services to that community lived in that community. All of the teachers came in every morning, all the police force, and the concept of neighborhood policing, that was totally foreign. These people never lived in there, and I saw right away this was a bad thing, but it exists, particularly in Connecticut.
Let me tell you about education. We teach civics if it's like some esoteric subject. I mean, we're actually supposed to teach kids how to engage in the political process while seeing their school board members, seeing their local representatives right then and there. And it's almost impossible for a teacher to really show that, hey, community matters. I'm here with you. I am invested in you. It's just not. There's something completely off. And I will say this: we talk a lot about economics. And I do too, obviously. We need to have a new moral force in this country, and we are nonpartisan at Brookings. I will say that. However, we've seen an immoral force for quite a long time in the presidency. Where's that moral force to bring back the concept of community? We don't have to get as deep as John Rawls or Martin Luther King Jr. and all the other great philosophers sharing their communitarian perspective. But we simply just do not talk about why are we working in the first place? What's our purpose? What does it mean to live out democratic values? And for me, it's I think the new era, we're going to get past sort of this always talking about dollars and cents and start talking about community, membership, belonging, togetherness. Because if there's anything I learned from this pandemic is that when our neighbors are sick, we are all vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And that is true economically. We have neighbors who are sick, who can't pay their rent. And then you have others who are saying, oh, don't give them $9 an hour. I mean, give me a break. I mean, this is, at some point, we've got to have a healthy, productive conversation about ethics, morality, community, democracy. Because this is just not tenable. I mean, the numbers are absolutely clear, but we have a failure to act on them. And that's about morality and ethics for me.
Well, thank you. I'm going to ask one question about wealth distribution, and then I'll turn it back over to my colleague. We've learned a lot this year in a lot of our talks about wealth distribution in the United States, and the disparities between groups. And we've just touched a little bit this week on the issue of tax policy. And let me talk about income tax policy and income tax rate, because I see several competing proposals out there. You see one which is easy to understand by Elizabeth Warren, which says, just let's tax, raise the upper rates. The OECD takes a little different view of that and says that really hasn't worked. You go to the highest tax brackets, you tax them, that's capital that can flee easily and move, and you will not get it. And so I just wanted to I am not a trained economist, although I try and masquerade as one at times. So I'm going to ask you, as a real economist, what is your view on differing income tax proposals?
And I'll just be clear, I'm not an economist either. I hang out with a bunch of the Brookings so, I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. I'll say it's a good thing. But in general, it's you're not, at some point, you're not going to squeeze blood from a stone. I mean, we know where revenues are. And we've also seen how the wealthy have manipulated tax policy and used their wealth to change tax policy in their favor. So I do think the money held by the wealthiest can easily be redirected in other ways, and to avoid sharing those coffers. But I do think that we need a new inheritance tax when people die. That wealth should be more distributed to the public. I mean, we literally have people flying to outer space, and I mean based upon and while at the same time denying people the right to mobilize, organize, and actually develop the wealth so they can go to outer space. And so for me, I'll save the tax conversation for some of my colleagues at Brookings. But it is clear to me that if we're going to provide college education, a free college education, if we're going to provide people with the social safety net we need, if we're going to create the infrastructure we need in this country, that money has to come from somewhere. And it's not going to come from working class and middle class people. They actually pay a higher percentage of their income. So it has to come from the higher wage earners. This trickle down, era we've been in has not worked. It's made matters worse. So for me, at some point, you got to tax the wealthy, and it is going to be difficult because, like I said, people have manipulated tax code. But at some point, that has to happen.
Thank you. I defer to my colleague.
Thank you, Errol. Dr. Perry, as you did in your speech, I'd like to maybe sort of point us in a direction of hope and solutions, because you've described for us a pretty profound and deeply intertwined set of problems that center on racism, a lack of moral imagination, a broken economic system, broken financial systems. And these problems seem to exist at multiple levels, and some are global in nature. Where do we jump in? Where's the right place, the right level, the right intervention to start breaking the cycles that you've described that just seem to continue in a downward spiral in many ways?
Well, I learned a lot about 2020. I released my book in the middle of the pandemic. Now, my studies got a lot of attention before then, but it really wasn't until after this racial reckoning did my work really take off. And it was because people were in the streets demanding change. And I really think the first order of business is to continue that demand, to say, hey, enough is enough. We need a new direction. And that's occurring right now. And to the folks out there, I say, keep the foot on the gas. Let's keep pressing for change, structural change, and we're actually seeing it. When redlining was created, it didn't come from Washington; it came to Washington. You had Baltimore had a policy where they determined the Black neighborhood as dangerous and contagious. And then that was picked up by several municipalities, and eventually it moved its way up to the federal government, and they adopted that policy, made it national. What I'm seeing all across the country with these reparations programs, with changes in local governments, efforts from corporations to address this issue, you're starting to see a grassroots movement to say, okay, I've heard, I understand, it's time for change. And eventually that grassroots organizing and efforts will bubble up to the national government, and we're going to see a new policy framework. And we actually already are. Remember, before when the pandemic set in, economists we're saying, oh, the sky's going to fall. We're headed towards a depression. We won't recover for some would say decades. And that hasn't happened largely because we've seen the impact of federal spending on what it can do. And so for me, instead of saying, hey, we need to invest in businesses that are too big to fail, we need to invest in working class people. It can actually uplift an economy. And so we're in that midst of local movements bubbling up. It's certainly influenced Biden and his policies. We haven't seen this much change since FDR and the New Deal, which by the way, created generations of wealth builders, except for Black people, because we were excluded. And so I'm very hopeful that the work people are doing today will lead to generational change and a policy paradigm shift that will finally put the final nail in the coffin of trickle-down economics. And we'll start to see a more cooperative effort to work and live and to politic together. And so for me, I'm very hopeful about the future.
That's great. One other, what I hope will be a hopeful kind of question is that Dr. Bostic mentioned earlier this week the work that the Federal Reserve banks are doing around creating opportunity and equity on a race basis, on a gender basis, on a geographic basis. And he mentioned that you've collaborated with them on some of their work and some web series. Can you comment a little bit about that and your collaboration with the Fed?
Let me tell you, the Fed is, they're doing a lot of good work. Bostic and others, other presidents there. I remember when we used to talk about full employment and everyone would say, oh, look, we're at a state of full employment, everything's good. But when you looked under the hood, Black people were suffering in cities and rural communities suffering as well. And Bostic and the Fed Reserve System overall, Jerome Powell, but even before that, the previous Fed chair, Janet Yellen, started looking at different ways to analyze the state of the economy besides using unemployment as the major barometer, because when we primarily use that yardstick, Black people were essentially the sacrificial lambs of full economy. You could have a growth and ignore the conditions of Black people and everything would be okay. And so kudos to the Fed Reserve for saying, hey, we're going to use a dashboard, multiple metrics, looking at shared prosperity in general. And that when the Fed started doing that, not just tinkering with interest rates and leaving everything alone, saying, I don't have anything to do with it. They're even saying now, we need to change. So if the Fed Reserve is responding to local demand, times are changing. Times are changing. So that's why I'm encouraged.
Thank you. I was particularly fascinated with your line that said all value is a social construct. I was hoping we weren't going to get into a Bitcoin discussion right then or not. I do have a question that has come in, and it's not a complex one at all. It's a very personal one. That would you share with our viewers how you got from Wilkinsburg to the Brookings Institution?
Well, you don't come from where I'm from and ascend to great heights without a lot of people doing great work. But I will say this, I'm always asked a similar question, that what made you so different? And I say, well, I'm actually no different than my father who was murdered in jail. Mm-hmm. I'm no different than my cousins who are struggling. The system really yanked up geniuses all over our community. And I say this all the time, I am not the smartest in my clan. I'm not the brightest. I'm not the hardest working in my family. And so I say that I'm no different. I'm no different than my family members. It's just that they got snatched up and I made it through. But I will say this, that um, it's always important to to put someone else in your position. I'm very proactive now. I'm older. I'm 50 plus, and I say all the time, my goal is to elevate other voices. And if people look at my book, Know Your Price, I try. Certainly there's a personal narrative there, but the goal is to uplift others, so that we can see their value. Because I'm so sick and tired of losing geniuses, losing brilliance, losing talent to racism. And I mean, the criminal justice system, the educational system, housing, we're just losing talent left and right. And so it was difficult at times, but not so much because I've always had a support system, as do others. But even with that support system, it's no guarantee for people from Homewood, Wilkinsburg, East Liberty, from East Cleveland, from Ferguson, Missouri, from New Orleans, Atlanta, Detroit. Lots of talent squelched by racism.
Thank you for that comment. We are getting near the end of our hour. Let me ask, as I always do, is there something we should have asked you that you wanted to talk about?
Well, you should have asked me. You said you're 50. You don't look 50. No.
No. I was getting ready to say, no, I'm not 50. I'm 77.
No, I do want to say this, that I am so happy that this speaker series is continuing, and I'm looking forward to the day that we can do this in person.
Absolutely.
Amen.
Because I mean, these are the kind of events that we need, and I'm grateful for. I'm grateful for technology and this, we can stay engaged, but please, go get vaccinated, wear your mask, because we need to come back to this kind of event in person. We need it now more than ever. And so I'm looking forward. I'm hoping that you'll still want me after this, so I can come back and because I hear so much about the town and the homes and the beautiful and how beautiful it is there. So I'm looking forward to joining you live one day. So I'll quickly write another book so I can come back.
Okay, let me say on air that we're going to invite you back. And we hope to be live next year on the grounds, and we couldn't agree with you more, to have a live audience asking lots of questions, talking about your books, for giving our speakers the opportunity to see the beauties of Chautauqua. And again, the themes that we have discussed are on our website, aaheritagehouse.org. If you want to talk about the origins of the Civil War, the history is there. We don't tell people what to think. We say, here are the facts. And again, our goal is we want to get the history right in order to get the understanding among people correct, which has to be there if we're going to have better relationships. And so with that, let me thank you for just a wonderful and enlightening discussion. I want to thank my colleague Tim as well, who actually bailed me out with the more substantive questions that I had, but it was a true pleasure being with you. And with that, let me thank our audience for tuning in once again. We look forward to next week's discussion. Before that, we will have a porch chat for those on the grounds on the porch of the Athenaeum on Sunday at 1 p.m. Come and talk about what you heard today, or what our next speaker will talk about as well, or any other issues that you have on your mind. But until then, again, thank you. See you next week.
CHQ Assembly is made possible through the collaboration and innovation of Chautauqua Institution's full-time and part-time staff, seasonal staff, and many volunteers, as well as participants like you, whose engagement, gifts, and subscriptions sustain our mission.